Welcome to the Foreign Policy Week in Review with Daniel McAdams. Thanks for joining me again, Daniel.
Hi, Jay. It's good to be back with you again.
Always good to talk to you. You know, yesterday I attended the Mises Circle event in Stamford, Connecticut, where Judge Napolitano, David Stockman, James Grant, Dr. Joseph Salerno were all speakers. My friend and yours, Jeff Deist, of course, was there to sort of lead the meeting. And I was really pleasantly surprised when a number of people came up to me and said how much they really enjoyed the discussions that you and I have here on this issue of foreign policy. And so, I said, well, gee, it's been a couple of weeks since you and I last talked, but I think, I was encouraged by that. And, if in that small gathering several people come up and say how much they appreciate it, then there must be an awful lot more that are out there listening. So I would like to pick up on a weekly basis again, Daniel, as your time and mine permit. But before we get into some of the most important foreign policy topics of this past week, I would like to ask, our listeners to know that you and Dr. Paul are really involved with a daily show now, a daily live show that people can watch. It starts at 12 o'clock noon Eastern Time. Could you tell our listeners a little bit about that?
Sure. This is, sorry, as you say, Jay, it's live streamed at 12 noon Eastern Time on Dr. Paul's YouTube channel. It's YouTube, and his channel is called Ron Paul Liberty Report.
Mm-hmm.
And this, as you know, Jay, Dr. Paul had been affiliated with this other organization, the Voices of Liberty, for, I guess, a couple of years, if I'm not mistaken, ever since he got out of Congress, maybe a year and a half. But that relationship has ended. He decided that he wanted to have more control over his show. He wanted to produce it out of Texas. He didn't want Hollywood folks to be involved, and he wanted to do it his own way. His big complaint was that he'd often want to go down there and talk about a current event, and they wouldn't put it up for a week or so, which defeats the purpose. So
sure.
His point is that he's no longer affiliated with the Ron Paul channel or Voices of Liberty, and now he has his own Ron Paul Liberty Report where he can really just be Ron Paul, which I think is a real benefit to everyone.
Oh, absolutely.
And I'm humbled that I've been picked to be his co-host, which is it's a tough thing to do in a way. But I find myself sitting there learning half the time. As I'm sitting there, we did an episode yesterday on free trade versus managed trade. This Trans-Pacific Partnership and the fast track. And I actually just asked him a question because I was curious, and he went into this long response that was just so interesting. So it's fun for me too, and I hope the listeners and the viewers enjoy it as well.
Well, I'll bet they will, and I think the fact that it's live and it's fresh all the time. So the topics you're talking about, and of course the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, I guess it's TPP is what it's called, is up for a vote, and it looks like it's going to probably go through. Is that your view?
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing that we brought up in the show too is that it's absolutely secret. Even with CAFTA and NAFTA, we got a chance to look at the 1,000 or so pages.
Yeah.
But with this one, if members of Congress want to see it, they have to go into a secure facility in Congress. It's called a SCIF. And they have to go to a secure facility. They cannot bring their staff in. If they take any notes at all, they have to leave them behind when they leave the room. So this is transparency. This is what Obama promised us, transparency.
Oh, wow, yeah. Some transparency. And what people don't, the reason they have to hide it is because it's a scandal, really, I think, Daniel, from what I understand about it. It's just another removal of sovereignty of all these nations, because as I understand it, on issues of commerce, and I don't know what else, but on issues of commerce at least, no longer will the United States courts be allowed to determine issues in the United States, but a tribunal of all of, what are the 13 countries or so that are signatories to this?
Yeah.
All of them will, there will be one court for the TPP. And so American courts won't have anything to say about it then. That's my understanding. Is that yours?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and as Dr. Paul pointed out, I'm sorry, Jay, none of the BRICS countries are involved in this. And so this is something that I'm sure you know more about than I do, but this will really just accelerate the fall of the dollar as the world's currency, because it accentuates this developing cleavage between the dollar and those that follow the dollar, and things like the Chinese investment bank that's coming up, and the others. So
Yes.
it's going to have the opposite of effect of what they think it will be.
Yeah, and I think it probably just highlights and probably really accentuates the tension between the BRICS and the Anglo-American. I call it the Anglo-American Empire, or the post-World War II, let's say the U.S. and NATO, essentially.
Yeah.
On the other
Absolutely.
hand.
Absolutely.
Well, could you talk a little bit about a very interesting discussion you had with Dr. Paul yesterday, and it had to do with NATO. I think the topic was, is NATO looking for a new war? What was that all about? What were you talking about there?
Well, it's interesting because this week NATO is launching its largest ever war games in the Baltic Sea. They're sending in destroyers and all sorts of ships to simulate anti-submarine warfare, and it's just one in a number of military exercises that NATO is undertaking. I think there are 6 major exercises this year. Many of them take place on the Russian border. There was just, I think, a month and a half or 2 months ago, the U.S. had some major, I think we even talked about this, Jay, major military material just 300 yards from the Russian border.
Wow.
In addition to this sea exercise this week, there's also 2 separate military exercises, one in Estonia and one in Lithuania. These are both NATO military exercises. And NATO's Rapid Reaction Force is set to double to 30,000 troops. So this is a major escalation. One Russian general estimated that even just last year, NATO's operations on the Russian border increased by 80%. So this is really a radical escalation of NATO. And so what we were discussing is this, are they just looking to keep their relevance? Are they looking to provoke a war? And it's kind of funny, as they keep escalating these different military exercises and live fire exercises, as they're escalating these, they accuse the Russians at the same time of escalating.
Yeah, it's I guess the psychological dynamic of projection. You know, it's not you that's doing it; it's the other guy, and then you're justified for striking him. I mean, I think it has something to do with, like, if you're angry at somebody, but you can't bring yourself to admit you're angry at somebody. What you do is you subconsciously antagonize them into striking at you, and then you can strike back. Well, that seems to be kind of what we were doing all along with our false flags that has been such a historical fact, actually, as we talked to James Perloff on my radio show on a monthly basis now, and on the basis of his research and a lot of other information that's out there, getting us into wars, getting the American people to support wars, you have to have some justification, or getting someone else to strike at you, so then now you can really get into it with them. So sort of antagonizing, it seems to me, if Russia or China were sitting out in the Gulf of Mexico somewhere doing exercises, I wonder how we would look at that.
That's exactly what I was about to say, Jay. Can you imagine if they were doing live fire exercises just outside of U.S. territorial waters? So technically they were within their rights, but there certainly would be some eyebrows raised.
My goodness!
And if you want to take that even further, look at the the unrest in Baltimore over the past week or so, over the shooting. You know, a lot of people are in the streets and demonstrating and getting violent. Imagine if Russia or China or Iran sent some of their top politicians to go down there and hand out cookies and encourage these people to overthrow the government like the U.S. did in Ukraine.
Victoria Nuland.
Yeah, I don't think it would be well received. So once again, you see the hypocrisy.
Yeah. Well, you and I see the hypocrisy. You see the hypocrisy, Ron Paul, at the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. These are the sort of facts that you point out that the mainstream is never going to touch, never going to come close to. And if only the American people could understand what's really going on as opposed to the propaganda, we would really have a fighting chance in this country of retaining our freedom, because I think, Daniel, very much the lack of freedom here at home is connected to what we're doing overseas. And speaking of that, your topic today, which I did watch, the live show that you have every day at 12 o'clock noon Eastern Time with Dr. Paul, you talked about what Judge Napolitano talked to us about yesterday at the Mises event, and that was the court ruling on NSA spying of Americans, right?
Yeah, the Sixth District Court of Appeals, I believe it was in New York, ruled yesterday that the NSA's bulk collection of our telephone records was not legal. And it's interesting on a number of levels. On one hand, obviously, it's encouraging to have it ruled not legal. I think it justifies what people like Ed Snowden and others have done to expose this spying. It makes him more of a whistleblower than a traitor, obviously.
Absolutely.
If the U.S. government is doing illegal activities.
Absolutely.
And I think it gives a psychological boost to our side. But on the other side of the coin, it just being ruled unlawful says nothing about its being unconstitutional, which is the real issue.
Mm-hmm.
Because whether or not it's, quote, lawful according to what Congress passes, the real issue is whether it does destroy our Fourth Amendment protections and others.
Right.
And the court did not address this. And as a matter of fact, the court, even though finding it was illegal, did not tell the NSA to stop doing it. So
right.
it basically punted and said, but we know that Congress is trying to work this out now, and I'm sure they'll work it out some way.
Oh.
So
yeah, so it's not, you know, it's really a good, so it's a decision that we are certainly happy about, but it doesn't really go very far, I guess, is what you're saying, and no doubt it will be challenged, perhaps ultimately in the Supreme Court.
Well, the big fear is that what's going to happen, and we predicted this on the show because we've seen it so many times. First of all, there is a deadline at the end of the month. These provisions of the Patriot Act are set to expire.
Right.
And as Congress always does, it'll wait toward the last minute, and then it'll have it'll pretend to have a panic attack, and say if we don't rush something through quickly, we're going to all be attacked.
Right.
And Mitch McConnell is already positioning himself to do this.
Yeah.
He's saying we can't let this thing expire. Let's just pass my version as a stopgap while we can continue to debate it. And his version, of course, is to reauthorize everything as it was, with no changes, for 5 more years.
Oh, my goodness.
So a stopgap is 5 years.
Oh, my goodness.
So this is what they're going to do. They're going to say, oh, this court ruling is really terrible. It just shows how much we need to reform. But reform is going to be making it legal. So they'll write it into the law. Reform will be making it actually worse for us than it is now.
Oh, it's incredible. It really is incredible, and I would tell my listeners that they should go to the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. It's a very short clip, I think less than 2 minutes, from Judge Napolitano saying exactly why. The pretense is that these NSA spying is going to keep us safe, when in fact the judge points out it certainly hasn't done a very good job of it. Witness the events in Texas just last week.
Absolutely. These are guys who've been on the FBI's radar for almost 10 years. They've been cultivated by FBI agents and well known to them and even arrested. Yet somehow they're allowed to, they get away with plotting and planning and carrying out this attack. There's something very fishy about that.
Right. You wonder, how can we keep buying this lie? I mean, that's the question. Of course, the Ron Paul Institute isn't buying it. But go ahead.
I'm sorry, Jay. I was going to say at the very least they're so incredibly incompetent that we should ask for a refund for all the money we spend.
Yeah.
At worst, I don't even want to ponder it, so I won't.
Yeah. Well, that's right. We can get into some very dark territory, perhaps, if we go there. But all right. Well, that's the one more topic I'd like to ask you briefly about before we conclude our discussion today, and that has to do with Yemen. You and I have talked the last time we were talking. I think we talked about Yemen, but there was a very good clip at the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity website from a lady. I think maybe she has something to do, a professor that has something to do with the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity, was talking about how, in fact, our support of Saudi Arabia, if anything, is making our enemies stronger.
Yes, that's Professor Hilary Mann Leverett from American University, and she is on the board of advisors at the Institute. And she had a terrific clip on CCTV about who's benefiting from the Saudis. I think 5 weeks of attacks on poor Yemen. And not only are they attacking Yemen, Jay, but they're blockading the ports so they can't get any food, and they rely on 90% of their food is imported.
Huh.
So they're basically starving them to death in addition to bombing them to death.
Mm-hmm.
But guess who's coming out on top is Al Qaeda, and Professor Leverett talks about this, and she points out that the Saudi attack on Yemen eviscerated any of the moderate Sunni Islamists in Yemen. They're just gone.
Yeah.
They lost all credibility, and so what it does, it opens the door for Al Qaeda to come in and pose as the saviors, and that's what they've done. And as she points out, they have an increasingly strong foothold in Yemen since these attacks.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's really interesting because what I see how we support Saudi Arabia, and my friend David Jensen, we have had a number of podcasts on J. Taylor Media that's talked about the importance of the petrodollar. You know, after Nixon took us off the gold standard in 1971, immediately, well, a few months later, Dr. Kissinger went to Saudi Arabia and worked out a deal with the Saudis in which all the oil would have to be paid for in dollars. That provided a bid for the dollar. Otherwise, why would you need dollars? It's no longer attached to anything of any value. It doesn't have gold attached to it anymore. And so I believe that much of what's been going on, you try to make some rhyme or reason out of all of this military activity that we're involved with, the bombings, the killings, and everything. And the only thing I can see out of this, Daniel, is the possibility that what's in play here is maintaining control of the oil markets so that the dollar will continue to have a bid under it. Because if the dollar goes away, the ability for the bankers and the people that run our country basically to continue to print money out of thin air and use those tickets to take away the assets around the world, the valuable materials, and to gain the world's wealth, America suddenly goes down. It goes down big time because its currency is worthless. So to me, I think I see a bigger picture here. For the longest time, Daniel, you've been talking to me about what's going on in the Middle East and how rather than make us safer, it's making us more endangered. It's making us more at risk. As Dr. Paul said when he was running for president, the reason they came over here is because we're over there. The CIA even said that. So why are we doing this? Why do we continue to get involved in these kind of military exercises when all it does is makes America less safe? In my view, for whatever it's worth, and David Jensen and I have talked about this, is very possibly it has nothing to do about making America safe. You talked about the Trans-Pacific Partnership and these deals that are really to take away the sovereignty of America. I think there's some bigger interests out there that are really thinking about themselves and not giving a rat's behind about America. That's just my thoughts.
Yeah, I think you've got it. I think the petrodollar, the propping up the dollar. I think there are geopolitical issues at stake as well, and I think when you have a kind of a perfect storm of the U.S. desiring to be the regional hegemon, or the world's hegemon, needing to prop up the dollar, especially in the Middle East, you have a very, very strong pro-Israel component in the U.S. Congress, and I think that leads them to want to give Iran a black eye. They want to scuttle this deal, and so I think these things have come together, and it's very powerful when these interests come together. It makes it difficult to argue against it or to fight against it.
Yeah, it really does. And the unfortunate thing is that most Americans are not at all aware of what's going on, and secondly, it is the future of America that's at stake here. That it's really a sad day, and again, as we've said many times, it's making us less safe, not more safe. It's destroying our prosperity too because of the massive amounts of our resources that are going into killing and destroying people and buildings and property around the world. So
absolutely.
Well, anyway, Dan, I want to thank you again for spending some time with us, and we want to keep up with what all you're doing at the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity, and also again suggest to our listeners that they tune in at 12 o'clock. I guess that's every day, Monday through Friday, I suppose, Daniel, right?
That's it right now. That's the plan right now. We'll see what happens. We'll see if we get the support. And
yeah, if you can continue it up. I know it's an effort on your part and Dr. Paul's part, but I want to thank you very much for your tireless efforts in bringing out truth about what foreign policy is really about. Thanks so much, Daniel. We'll look forward to doing it again next week.
Thank you very much.